So I'm going to go over characters and like a summary of the story so y'all kind of understand the movie a bit more. So first is Mr. Holland. He's the main character, and the movie follows the 30-year span of his career being the music teacher at John F. Kennedy High School. Next is Coach Meister. He kind of took Mr. Holland under his wing on the very first day of school where Mr. Holland was there, and their relationship just kind of evolved, and they ended up being big support systems for each other throughout the movie. Next is Iris Holland, who is Mr. Holland's wife, and then their son Cole Holland, who has a 90% hearing loss, which can cause some issues later on in the movie because he can't hear, and in Mr. Holland's eyes at first you could only hear music to appreciate it and feel it. Next is Principal Jacobs. She hired Mr. Holland to JFK, and while they got off to an awkward start, she ended up becoming a really big guide for him. Going along with that is Vice Principal / Principal Walters. He became principal when Principal Jacobs retired, and he didn't like Mr. Holland from the start. Mr. Holland wasn't a big fan of him, and he was just kind of a thorn in Mr. Holland's side throughout the movie. Then Gertrude Lang is the redhead in the pigtails. She was kind of his first breakthrough student. She was really bad at the clarinet, and she wanted to get really good so she could have a talent just like the rest of her family. But through working with Mr. Holland endlessly, she finally was able to do it. And then Louis Russ, this Jim right here, he was another kind of breakthrough student. He seemed like a lost cause when it came to learning music, but he needed to so he could get academic credit so he could go out for sports again. And eventually he was able to do it, and he went to state wrestling finals. And then third in the black and white is Rowena Morgan. She is a major factor in the story, and I touch more on her later. Some major events in the story, rock and roll. He plays rock and roll in class after just months of apathy from the students, apathy from him. It's just not going well, and they all did horribly on a test. So finally, he asks what kind of music they like, and they all like rock and roll, and he shows the connection between a composition from Bach and a really popular rock and roll song, and they had fun for the first time in class ever, and that's kind of how he got his groove as a teacher. And then next is them finding out about their son, Cole's hearing loss. That caused not only external conflict between Mr. Holland and Cole and Iris because he couldn't form a relationship. It caused great internal conflict within Mr. Holland because he could not figure out how to cope with the fact that he felt as though he couldn't share his passion with his son. And it all comes to a head later on in the movie. Next is Rowena Morgan. She was the ingenue in the senior class musical, kind of in the middle of Mr. Holland's career, and she and him shared a passion for music and song and everything like that. And because of that, he kind of becomes entranced by her, and they form a bond, and she ends up being able to go pursue her dream of singing in New York, much opposite of Mr. Holland, who has yet to be able to pursue his dream. So there's that opposition right there. And she invited him to go to New York with her because they had this kind of weird relationship, and it caused a debate within him to leave his whole life behind and go pursue what he thought was his dream, or stay here with his wife and his child and at JFK. And obviously he ends up staying at JFK and realizing, I love my wife, I love my son, this is what I want to do. Like, I'm here, I'm going to stay and teach. And Rowena was also the only student to hear a little bit of his symphony that he was composing all throughout his career. And he even named a little piece of it after her because he was so entranced by her throughout that whole period of time with her. And then following that, he has a big fight with Cole, his son. He comes home from work one day, the day that John Lennon had been shot. And so obviously Mr. Holland is very upset, and Cole tries to empathize with him, and all Mr. Holland can say is, "You wouldn't understand," because he can't hear John Lennon's music. And that led to a big blowout fight with Cole essentially telling his father that he feels as though he cares more about his students than he does about his own son. And something really powerful about that scene in the movie was that Iris had to translate the whole thing because Mr. Holland never learned sign language well enough to be able to understand what his son was saying. So that kind of led to a big revelation for Mr. Holland, and he flipped a switch. He learned sign language. He put on a concert that was accessible for deaf and hard of hearing. He sang "Beautiful Boy" by John Legend to his son and learned how to sign it. And it just kind of really turned him around as a person. He became much less bitter. And then finally, goodbye, Mr. Holland. At the end of his career, he was forced to retire because the school board cut the fine arts and music from JFK. So he was forced to retire. He fought Principal Walters, he fought the school board, but he lost in the end and was leaving school not thinking or not knowing if he made an impact on any of his students. But he walks into the auditorium, and of course there's a big crowd of all of his past students cheering him on, thanking him for everything they did, everything he did for them. And then in the end, he has all of his past students play his symphony that he had been writing these past 30 years. So his life's work was playing his other life's work, and it was just a big full circle moment. And yeah, that's Mr. Holland's opus. How are students, teachers, and schools portrayed? I feel like in this movie, they were portrayed very differently than other quote-unquote teacher movies, as in it just all seems a bit more normal, a bit more realistic. The students are portrayed as pretty apathetic, and most of them seem to be in that class because they quote-unquote have to be there for a fine arts credit or something, aside from the handful of students who were actually really passionate and wanted to learn more about music, which I feel like is pretty typical of a regular high school music appreciation class. And going along with that, I feel like it was a more normal portrayal of teachers. Mr. Holland was not like the obvious hero of the story. He didn't swoop in and rescue all of these students who were on the verge of going down the wrong path and turn them on the right one and totally change their lives, flip it upside down, all of that, like we see a lot. He was honestly kind of an underdog. He did his job. He pushed his passion onto the students, and in turn they became passionate as well, which is what good teachers do. And he didn't even realize that he made such an impact. He was leaving JFK not knowing if he made any impact at all until all of those students showed up. All of those past students from the 30 years showed up at the school and essentially showed him his impact, which I feel like is really reflective of being a teacher in general. You know, teachers do their jobs to the best of their abilities and hope that they make an impact on at least one student, and they don't even really know if they are unless they're told by the parents or the student or someone. So it was kind of refreshing to see it that way, a bit more realistic. Again, the school is portrayed like a normal high school. There wasn't anything that stuck out about it. No extremes in any way, shape, or form, like no gang activities, things like that, and no super uppity, snooty, really, really high socioeconomic class. All just very normal, very middle class, very reflective of like the high school I grew up in. There was an emphasis on academics rather than fine arts, which we find out in the end when music and arts get cut from the school. which I've never seen that happen in real life, but I'm sure it does happen. So that was very clear, and it was very clear with Mr. Walters when he became the principal, and even before that when he was the vice principal. And I thought it was just really interesting how this movie highlighted the growth of the teacher much more than the growth of the students. Usually that growth you kind of see going on simultaneously next to each other. And while we did see growth of some students, we largely just saw how much Mr. Holland evolved as a character. He went from a reluctant, unpassionate teacher just there because it was a fallback job to someone who didn't want to leave when he was done. He mentioned at the end something like he went into this job not wanting anything to do with it, and now it was the only thing he wanted to do, and he had to leave. So I thought it was just really cool that it focused so much on the growth of the teacher, on the growth of the hero, than of the students themselves, which we see a lot in these teacher school movies.
What normative concepts or ideas does the film either challenge or reinforce? So this movie challenges everything from curriculum to passion. Now, we talk about teacher as rebel in class, and the interesting thing is that I didn't even perceive Mr. Holland as a rebel until he was brought into the office for bringing students' passions of rock and roll into the curriculum. Now, Mr. Holland is called into the office for teaching students about rock and roll instead of just the classics. He says that I'm teaching music and that I will use anything from Beethoven to Billie Holiday to rock and roll if I think it'll help me teach a student to love music. To show that his intentions as a teacher are to bring out a passion of music within students and to teach them about their own interests is pretty incredible. And we saw this idea in the movie and this idea was brought to life in the book that we read, Spectacular Things, and we saw this in Project Citizen, where the teacher built upon students' passions and allowed them to co-create a curriculum. Instead of seeing this as a rebellious act and using this label of teacher as rebel, I see Mr. Holland as more of a teacher who teaches from the heart. He consistently finds himself putting all of his effort into making students better musicians, and at the end of the day, just opening up their futures because of that, giving their futures so much more opportunity than they even expected them to have. He sacrifices his entire career just to bring about passion and music into these students' lives, which is pretty incredible. And what lessons does the film seem to want the audience to learn? While Mr. Holland did not even recognize the impact he was making on his students, at the end of the movie, he really does see the true and strong impact that he made on everyone around him. He becomes so widely recognized for the good and passion that he brought to students around him. And two major themes that I see in this movie that I think stood out the most are, one, stand up for what you're passionate for. You see Mr. Holland doing everything that he can for his students to just bring music into their lives and hope that they become passionate about it as he is. And the second one, similar to the first, but preach your passion. Don't let anything else get in your way. Just preach what you believe and try to influence the most amount of people that you can with that belief and passion that you have.
One implication that caught our attention from the film about public perception of schools and education is how fine arts is always assessed. What we mean with this is that it is always said that fine arts are never taken a whole lot in consideration. It is always first academics and sports, and the rest of the subjects are never a priority. An example of this takes place in this movie when almost by the end of the film, Jean asks to meet with Mr. Holland and tells him that after a meeting they had with the Board of Education, they had to make a decision to cut the entire music and art program, since they were asked to submit proposals on ways to reduce costs. Mr. Holland then answers with this quote, "Well, I guess you can cut the arts as much as you want, Jean. Sooner or later, these kids aren't gonna have anything to read or write about." The importance of music and art is almost never taken in consideration at schools. The positive impact and inspiration art and music can have on students goes way beyond what most people think.